All right, so starting from the Bootstrap boilerplate, basically this web page that they've given us that includes a head section and body section. Basically right in here is where we want to think about putting our content, right? So if you were going to use this for your own web page, you can just put your own content in here, and of course you can add any additional meta tags or whatever you need to in the head section. So what we want to focus on is creating a layout similar to the way we've created layouts in things like CSS Grid and Flexbox and whatnot. Okay, so Bootstrap has in its style sheet, it's got a grid system pretty similar to CSS Grid. It's got a series of rows and columns. Now, the one thing that you need to remember is that in Bootstrap land, there's a default number of columns, 12 columns. And so if you want to have something go across the entire page, that's 12 columns. If you want to have something go halfway across the page, that's 6 columns. And so you kind of have to figure out proportions based on, increments of 1/12. Okay? So here, let's get rid of Hello World. We don't need that headline. And let's take a look at this system. First of all, we need a row. And I'm going to do something I don't love to do, which is using div tags. Because the rows don't really have a structure of their own. They're containers. So there's not a need for semantics on this. But I'm going to say div, and I'm going to go with a class. The way that most of the things work in Bootstrap is with predetermined classes, pre-created classes. So then the trick is to know which class you want your content to connect to. And in this case, I'm creating a row, and so the class is simply row. Okay, and then give it a couple of lines and close the div. Okay, so this creates a row, and then inside this row, I want to create my header, right? So I can create a header, and in my header, I want to set this to class equals call. And we can say h1 header. And then I want to end header. Okay. Now what's going on here is that, and I can break this out if this is too, if you'd prefer to have it stacked here, you can do that. Anyway, what's going on here is that the class call is for column, and this is built into Bootstrap, and it's smart enough to subdivide. So if I had a row and it has one column in it, it will go, all the way across the page. If I have a row and it has 2 columns in it, then it'll go half, then each one will go half the page. If it has 3 columns in it, then each one will go a third of the page, etc., etc. Okay, so that exists. But then in addition to that, you can be more specific, and you can also be responsive. So let's go another row. And so in this row, we want to have a nav, a main, and an aside. So 3 different items, right? So one thing I could do is I could say nav class equals call, and I could say h1 nav, and then close the nav, right? I could do that, and I could just duplicate that. And the second one I could change to main. And the third one I could change to aside. Okay, I believe that this will work, but then we'll come back in a minute and I'll show you how to take greater control over it. Okay, and then finally, let's do this. I'm just going to be really lazy and copy the header all over again, and then we'll just change out header for footer. Oh, one thing I should have thought about is that these are all empty containers, and by default they have no border, they have no background color, anything. So right now all of this is invisible, right? The only thing you would see is these floating words. So I could use styles, but I don't want to confuse things with these different classes. I mean, I could use internal styles, but I don't want to confuse things with these classes. So I'm just going to use inline styles. So I'll just go right here inside the header and just say style equals border 1 pix solid. Okay, and then we'll just take that and, oh, I forgot the quotation mark. And we'll pop it into each one of these just to make sure you can see them. Okay, another thing that happens is that this is going to expand to fit the page, and sometimes the external, the outer borders kind of get lost on the edge of the page. So just to make sure you can see them, I'm going to throw one more style in here. In fact, I can paste the one I've got. And I'm just going to put a little bit of margin on the body. And I got caps lock on. But the reason I'm doing this is just to keep it away from the edge a little bit so that you can see what's going on. So let's just give this, I don't know, 50 pixels. Okay, let's take a peek, see if this worked or not. Hang on, I've lost my way here. Here we go. All right, so here it is. This gap around the outside of the page was created by putting 50 pixels of margin on the body itself. Even though it's margin, it acts like padding because there is no external to the body. But then the cool thing about this is that it is responsive, so it's going to accordion with the page. Okay. Now, column, we said column once in the row 1, and so the column took up the entire row, or 100% of the page, and we did that with the header and the footer. But with the middle row, we said column, 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 and so now we got 3 columns that are the same size. Okay, so all is good. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that there is some responsiveness built in, such that if I collapse this too much, oh, nothing. Okay, never mind about that. If I just say column, then this is just going to be relative sizing, and it's going to grow and shrink with the page. But as we know, sometimes that doesn't work layout-wise, so I'm going to show you how to deal with that as well. Okay, first things first. In the second column, let's say I want the nav to be much thinner than that, I want the main to be much wider than that, and I want the aside to be a little thinner than it is. All right. So I need to take control over the width of these 3 columns. If I just say call, they're going to be equal to each other. So if I want to specify how many columns on a 12-column grid each one of these is going to be, the way I would do that is I would say call dash LG, LG for large, and then I would say dash, and I would say, okay, how many columns do I want the nav to be? Let's say I just want that to be 2 columns out of 12. And then for main, maybe I want the main to be dash LG dash 7. So 7 and 2 is 9, which means that out of 12 I've got 3 left. Okay. Now let me explain the LG. One cool thing that's built into Bootstrap is this idea of responsiveness. They're trying to make it as easy as possible. And so instead of you having to create media queries to make things change at certain page width breaks, what happens is Bootstrap has large for like a laptop or bigger, It's got medium for a tablet, like an iPad or bigger, and then it's got small for phone. And so by saying column large, we're saying that this would apply to a laptop or a desktop. Okay, and then you'll see as we bring the page down smaller than that, it'll automatically revert to a different layout for a phone or something smaller than a desktop or laptop. Okay, so basically what we're doing here is setting a differential based on 12 column grid. The nav will be 2 columns, the main will be 7 columns, and the aside will be 3 columns. So we started with this where the nav, main, and aside were all the same. We hit refresh, and now the nav is thinner, the main is bigger, and the aside is about that small. Okay, just so you can see that this is meant to be a layout, let me add a little height in here. Don't do this if you're following along on your own. Don't do this. This is just for demonstration purposes. Normally, the content of the block is going to determine the size of the block, so you shouldn't be setting a height on yours. Okay, I'm just going to throw in some height. On this aside, I'm going to do a min height, and I'll explain why here in a minute. Okay, just to make it look more like a layout. So if your page is this wide, then you can see here's a header, here's a nav, here's a main, here's a side. Okay, now as I was mentioning, those column widths were based on this responsive idea that this is for a large screen, like a laptop or a desktop. And if we bring this in enough, watch what happens to the layout. Bang. Okay, so once we bring it in far enough, and I don't know off the top of my head what that delimiter is, but once we bring it in far enough, it reverts to a stacked layout for a phone or a tablet, since we just said LG for large. Okay, so it will automatically change all the column widths to go 100% the width of the screen in order to excuse me, in order to be responsive to a phone screen or a tablet screen. It does that automatically. All I had to do to enact that was to make sure I use this LG part of the class. Okay. Now, what about if I wanted an intermediate layout? What if I wanted, a desktop layout, and then a tablet layout, and then a phone layout? What if I wanted an intermediate, a middle one? So what you can do in that situation is you can actually add in another class. And so you could say all over again, class equals, but you don't have to. All you have to do is put a space after the previous class, and then say call -md for medium, and then in the medium or like the tablet layout, how wide do I want the navigation to be? Well, let's say I wanted to change the layout so that the nav became a horizontal nav. Well, in that case, it's going to go all the way across the width of the screen, which is 12 columns. Okay, and then down here for main, maybe I want to increase that a little bit, so we can say MD 8, and then down here, if this is taking up 8, that means there's 4 left for the aside. Okay, and so what's going to happen is it's going to listen to LG when the screen is wide enough for a desktop or laptop, and it's going to listen, and it's going to ignore that, and it's going to listen to the MD when the screen is the appropriate width for a tablet. And then it's going to ignore both of these and give me a stacked layout when the screen is thin enough for a phone. That's the idea. So let's see how this looks. Refresh. And then when I bring this in, it's going to hit the breakpoint. Bang. Okay, so here's the tablet layout where the nav becomes its own row because we set the columns to 12, and then my main and my aside take up the remaining space. And then if I keep bringing it in, bang, it goes stacked. Okay, so remember earlier when I put in this aside min height 200 pixels, I just did that so that it would show up in the stacked layout with a little bit of height. Otherwise it would have been as skinny as the nav is. Okay, so that's what that's all about. Okay, so once again, similar wireframe that we did with other techniques. We did this with CSS Grid, we did it with Grid View, we did it with Flexbox, and now we've done it here with Bootstrap. And so that's all we're going to do in this lesson, is just get control of the layout, get control of the layout by creating a wireframe. And it needs to be responsive with these 3 different settings, or 3 different widths. Okay. In future lessons, what we're going to do is go more in depth in Bootstrap and learn different features and different tools with the CSS front end library. All right, so if you have any questions, contact your instructor.